I was recently talking with someone about this passage, and they literally told me that this one verse used to make them angry. And I'm afraid that if we don't treat this text well, we will miss out on so much that God has for us. I'm Joel, and welcome to Armchair Theologian, as we dive into our series on the Epistle of James, Jesus according to Jake. Now, because I believe in the primacy of Scripture, let's take a moment to dive into this text and really give it the honor and the respect that it deserves. We're going to be discussing James chapter 1, verses 2 through 11. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. He must ask in faith, without any doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. But the brother of humble circumstances is the glory in his high position, and the rich man is the glory in his humiliation. Because like a flowering grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too, the rich man, in the midst of his pursuits, will fade away. Originally, I had planned on breaking this up into 3 different videos, because when I was first looking at it, I thought of it as 3 different texts to consider, 3 different themes. And honestly, this does incorporate the 3 main themes of the letter in this one passage. But as I really began to look at it and consider it and study it, I realized that this is more of one passage. As we discussed in the introduction, Jacob, or James if you prefer, gives us a commentary on Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. Granted that Jake has what may seem like 3 separate ideas here, they come together as one when you consider a passage from the Sermon on the Mount. You see, it wasn't until I thought about Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27, that I realized that all of this comes together as one core idea. In Matthew 7, 24 through 27, this is where Jesus says, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house upon a rock. The rains fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and yet it did not fall, because it had been built upon the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rains fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall." So I'll circle back to our response to these trials and tribulations here in a moment, because I have a lot to say about that. It's those 3 verses that made my friend angry. But for now, I really want to talk about the overarching narrative here and how it fits in with what Jake is saying about the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus states that those who hear his teachings and don't act on them are foolish builders, and those who hear his teachings and build their lives on his teachings are wise. What you'll notice is that the rain, the floods, and the winds came to both of them. And that is to say that trials, tribulations, and testing come to everyone. That's really what the word is here when it says testing. It's not a question of if these difficulties will come to us. It's a question of how will you prepare for them. Because the wise builder is the one that lasts, Jake segues into what it takes to be a wise builder. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. The implication is, if you feel like you don't have the wisdom of God, which across the Bible, the understanding of what the wisdom of God is an understanding of God's ordering and structuring of the world, then what you need to do to get the wisdom of God for your situation, for your circumstance, is just ask. Jake tells us that God handles these humble requests without reproach. There is no shame in asking God for wisdom. The only prohibition here is for doubt. Now, this isn't doubt in general. This isn't, one of those things of like the question of, do you believe in God or do you not believe in God? And again, we're talking about asking for wisdom here. We're not talking about asking for things in general of God. But as you ask for wisdom, don't doubt in God's ability to give you wisdom. And I want to take a moment to give you a little bit of a thought picture. Let's take a moment and imagine the wisest person you know. Maybe it's your grandmother, maybe it's the proverbial old man of the mountain, maybe it's, some old professor. And as you consider that wise person, let's build a scale. Let's have the wise person on one end. Let's think about the archetype of a fool on the other side. So I'm not going to ask you to think of a fool specifically, but let's think about a stereotype, a Homer Simpson, a Michael Scott. Maybe it's Harry and Lloyd. Whatever your stereotype for the fool is, let's build our scale. The wisest person we can think of and someone that is utterly foolish. Again, think of your scale, wise and foolish. Now, I want to introduce another element into this. Where is God? Honestly, if God doesn't take your scale and shrink it to where the wisest person you can think of becomes more like a fool in comparison to his wisdom, I think you have a low view of God's wisdom. God sets the bar for what wisdom is. And Jesus, as God in the flesh, was the wisest person to ever walk the face of the earth. God is the grounding of all wisdom. He is the one that is the source of wisdom. And until we get that understanding of God as the source of wisdom, I'm afraid that we actually doubt him, that we doubt in what the truth of his wisdom is. And when you consider Jesus as the wisdom of God, you should see him as wiser than Plato. And I think that Dallas Willard put it so beautifully when in The Divine Conspiracy he says that Jesus, he is master only because he is maestro. Jesus as Lord can mean little in practice for anyone who hesitates before saying Jesus is smart. He's not just nice, he's brilliant. So before we ask God for wisdom, we need to trust that he is truly wise, that any wisdom that can be found is going to be found in him. And if we don't trust in God's wisdom, we find ourselves adrift at sea, tossed by the wind, tossed by the waves, listless and without a direction. But I think that James goes on to demonstrate another kind of doubt. Because it's one thing to doubt that God is actually the source of wisdom, but there's still another form of doubt that is a little more subtle. And I think it's in that next passage. This was an era rife with tension. Tension between the Jewish aristocracy and the poor tenant farmers. In context, Jake seems kind of fed up with the actions and the mentalities of the Jewish aristocracy. As such, he takes a step that flips what would be conventional wisdom on its head. You see, the wealthy would boast in their wealth. They saw their wealth as their source of security, their source of power, and what would get them through anything. The poor, likely day laborers and tenant farmers, would see themselves as in a more lowly position. They were living under the whims of the aristocracy. Jake declares that the poor have the high status and that the wealthy have the humble status. And that's where he flips what would be the conventional wisdom on its head, flips it upside down. And Jake's discussion of wealth and riches ties into our discussion of wisdom. Because if we think that our wealth and our means and our power will get us through difficult, then we're relying on ourselves and not trusting in God for his wisdom. It's another form of doubt. They don't see themselves as needing God because they can take care of themselves. And it's that conventional wisdom that flies in the face of biblical wisdom. And people often, for some reason, think that this phrase is in the Bible and it's not, but it's that idea that God helps those who help themselves. No, God helps the humble. He is near to the humble and the lowly of heart. And I'll note that money is ultimately a tool. It's what we do with it, how we treat it, that can become good or bad. It's a matter of, will we use it to become an idol? Will we use it as something that we worship, as something that becomes our heart's pursuit? Or is it something that we hand over to God for His use? When it becomes our chief love and our object of worship is when it becomes evil. When it becomes what we pursue above anything else is when we get into trouble. And this mentality is ultimately shifting sand. It's a sinking ship. It is the mentality that will lead towards destruction. Now, if we go back to the portion of this passage that made my friend angry, I think that it's very rich as we consider how we handle trials on a more practical basis, right? Because we've talked a lot about how do we prepare for trials? How do we prepare for difficulties? But what do you do when you're in the middle of it? James says, consider it all joy. Now let's talk about what in this passage made my friend angry. He admitted that he used to read it as, well, you just need to feel happy that you're in the middle of something terrible. That misses the heart of what James is talking about. First off, James says consider. This is mental assent. This is an act of the mind. We are evaluating our situation. And as we give it an evaluation, as we grade our situation, we realize that this is an opportunity for pure joy. The New American Standard, the translation that I use, translates this as all joy. But I do think that other translations get a little bit better when they say pure joy, because the descriptor there is on joy, not on the circumstance. It's easy for us to read this and think, consider all of it joy. But what James is saying is better thought of as consider it all joy. And again, this is not us trying to conjure up feelings, trying to make ourselves feel a certain way about our circumstance, but it's a change in our mentality. It's an opportunity to look at things differently. And we'll note that there is a because that follows this call for joy. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This evaluation of our circumstances as pure joy isn't just because of the circumstance, but because of what it can produce in us. James says that it produces endurance, the ability to continue on, to keep moving forward. And we see that James is highlighting that the joy to be found here in the trials and in the tribulations and in the temptations and the circumstances is what it produces. It's the fruit. That there is endurance, that there is perseverance that is built through this. When we endure well, we grow. James calls this work of endurance completion. This is spiritual maturity. And with this endurance, we find that we become a mature person and we become the mature person that someone else needs. It's easy to look at circumstances and think that there's no good to be found in them, that it's just a wash, that everything is lost. But the fact of the matter is, nothing is wasted. There is good to be found here if we will let the Spirit do His work. There is joy because there's a maturity that you can possess. There's depth to be carved out in your soul. And the tendency here is to neglect this idea, to go with what is the conventional wisdom, what is the perspective of everyone around us, the perspective of the world in general, that when you endure a bad situation, trials and tribulations and testings, we should shrink back to just wallow in the pain. But that's not the call that God has for us here. When we engage in the world's perspective on these difficulties, we miss out on so much that the Holy Spirit has for us. We miss out on an understanding of the heart of God that we wouldn't have outside of this trial. Often when we come into trials and testings, we find ourselves saying, why me? While that may be acceptable for a time, we can't allow this mentality to metastasize within our souls. In Philippians 3:10, Paul talks about not only knowing Jesus in the power of his resurrection, but also in the participation of his suffering. As difficult as it may be to say, it can do us so much good to look at Jesus and say, who am I to be so honored to get to participate in the sufferings of the Lamb? May Christ who was slain receive the glory. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, it is not the religious act that makes the Christian, but participation in the sufferings of God in the secular life. In the end, God wastes nothing. If we find ourselves in trials, we find joy because we have an opportunity to step into greater Christ-likeness. If we don't feel like we have the wisdom to endure, we can ask God and He will give us wisdom generously. He gives it to us without any kind of reproach or shame. But the one thing is, we shouldn't doubt that He is wise, that He knows how to properly order the world, that He can give us wisdom when we ask, and we shouldn't doubt Him by trusting in our own self-sufficiency, but rather trust in Him. God is our source, and not our wealth or our own power. Everything outside of Him will ultimately fail. As challenging as this passage can be, we have to let it work in our hearts. As we conclude, let me again thank you for joining us for this installment of Jesus According to Jake, a study on the Apostle of James. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Take it and share it with a friend via text message, or share it to your favorite social media platform to get it on out there. And be sure to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, thank you for joining me on Armchair Theologian.